spells have got to be one of the most important cards in Clash Royale. Like, could you imagine my Recruit's Hyper Bait deck without Void? I sure cannot. So today I'll be making every single spell balanced in the entire game with just one change. And I'll do this by Elixir order. Or maybe probably the opposite. Yeah, that sounds a lot safer. So, starting off the video, we have apparently Lightning. Personally, not a fan, but the objective of Lightning it is to kill the enemy's high HP troops. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Although, in my opinion, it also does deal quite a lot of damage to the tower as well, so I would slightly reduce the tower damage from 27% to 25%, going at Tournament Standard, or level 11, from 286 damage to 264 damage, keeping the role of tower damage more to those Rocket Cycle players. And speaking of Rocket, we now have Rocket. So the area or the radius would be increased from 2 tiles to 2.5 tiles. It is honestly way too hard to get value of the Rocket a lot of the times if you want to splash the tower and whatever troop, and I know that this is not a necessary thing, but I just find it really ridiculous that a literal rocket has less radius than a zap. So hopefully with this change, Rocket just becomes a little bit more versatile and slightly easier to use. Next we would have Graveyard. What a weird card. So the idea would be that the delay between each skeleton spawn would be increased from 0.5 seconds to 0.6 seconds. So on one hand, it is harder to spell the Graveyard away, because it takes longer for each skeleton to spawn. If your only option is a spell, you might be into slight trouble because, well, the skeletons will take longer to spawn, so you can only hit that many skeletons with just one single spell. On the other hand, because the skeletons do take longer to appear, defending them with troops would be easier. On top of that, an undefended Graveyard would be way much less effective. So hopefully with this change, Graveyard would be a bit more balanced. Next we would have the Poison, and the Poison slowdown effect would be reduced from minus 15% speed to minus 10% speed. Poison can do pretty much everything: offense, control, and defense against tanks because of the slowdown, so slightly reducing one of its attributes should make the Poison more in line with all of the other spells. Hopefully we're reducing a little bit its versatility. Next we have the Freeze. Now the Freeze tower damage would be increased from 30% to 60%, growing from 35 damage all the way to 70 damage at Tournament Standard or level 11. And essentially, the Freeze only has really good value once, which is the first and hopefully only time you ever use it. Now, by increasing the tower damage, the Freeze does get even a little bit more value, but it also slightly compensates more by cycling freezes onto the tower. Now, very unlikely for that to happen, but regardless, this is a buff that would help Freeze without making it overly broken at all. So hopefully this buff helps out Freeze a little bit. Next we would have Fireball. Evo Royal Hogs. When pigs can fly, I guess, it changed everything. Fireball is now a very utilized spell, and it just does almost everything a little bit too well. So its projectile speed would be reduced by 10%, essentially how fast it travels through the arena until the enemy. So just making the spell a little bit more skillful, and in the right hands it will still do everything you want, but you do need to be slightly more careful against faster enemy troops. Next we would have the Void. So its damage to single targets would be increased by 10%, meaning that if an enemy is hit by all 3 strikes, it would deal the exact same damage as one lightning strike, which would overall just help Void to deal more damage and have easier matchups against a lot of troops such as Archer Queen, for example, or Musketeer, which would die to only 2 strikes if I am correct as well. It would help with a lot of interactions, and I don't think that just 10% damage would make Void absolutely broken, ever since they reduced its damage by a whopping 32%. So hopefully this would make Void's interactions a little bit less niche in general. Next we would have the clone spell. Now its radius would be brutally increased from 3 tiles to 4.5 tiles. Now there is not a single spell in the game except for Tornado that has a bigger radius than 4.5 tiles. Meaning that if you actually cloned a massive army of an insane push, it would theoretically be a lot harder for the enemy to kill all of them with one single spell, which in a certain way would make clone slightly better against spells. Now, obviously this wouldn't change that much, but I really don't think that this would necessarily break the clone unless you were in a very bad situation where you didn't have any spells at all. But in that situation, even pre-buff clone would already destroy you. Next we would have the Tornado, and its pull power would simply be reduced by 10%. Would be slightly harder to pull literally every single troop in the game. So hopefully making the Tornado just a tiny bit less versatile overall. Next we would have Royal Delivery. Now I rarely ever see this spell except for like 1 or 2 decks. So now Royal Delivery on impact would knock back enemies by 0.3 tiles, and only light enemies, meaning it would knock back P.E.K.K.A. or Mega Knight for example. So this would make Royal Delivery just a little bit more versatile, especially against enemies that would indeed survive the impact damage, hopefully giving more room for the Royal Delivery to shine. Next we would have the Earthquake, and its crown tower damage would be reduced from 65% to 60%, going from 53 damage per tick to 48 damage per tick at tournament standard or level 11. Now the spell honestly can be very versatile, and even though it's only really good in a couple of decks, I feel like the crown tower damage, it is just way too high. So a slight nerf to it, I don't think it would kill the card, but in my eyes it really feels justified. Next we would have the Vines. The Vines are still doing great, a little bit too great even, so their damage would be reduced by 8%, going from 306 to 281 at level 11 or tournament standard, which means that now it would no longer kill cards like the Archers or Firecracker or other cards that would only die to arrows otherwise, making it a little bit more niche and more about the stun rather than just the kill power, which if you want the kill power, in my eyes you should go for arrows or Void. So hopefully with this nerf, the Vines become a little bit less versatile. Next we have the Goblin Barrel, and the Goblin deploy time would be reduced from 1.1 seconds to 1 second. The Goblins have received many nerfs, especially their first hit speed, and the Goblin Barrel has never had any sort of compensation, so it's time to slightly fix that, which would make the Goblin Barrel a little bit hard to react to. And the same would be applied to the Evil Goblin Barrel, to the fake goblins, making both of these cards just a little bit harder to deal with. Next we'd have arrows, and I thought a lot on how exactly could we nerf such useful spell, because it does a lot, and you do know the delay between each of the pieces of arrows. The damage, it's not 100% instantaneous. There is actually a delay between each tick of damage. It is very fast, but it is clearly there. So this delay would be increased from 0.25 seconds to 0.4 seconds. So now it would take a little bit longer to kill a majority of cards that would only die to arrows otherwise, making it actually very hard to even get the timing right against a Goblin Barrel, for example, with arrows at least. So arrows would be just a slightly less efficient spell overall, without taking its radius or its crown tower damage or its damage overall. Next on the list we have the Goblin Curse. Now there aren't that many buffs that I believe you could give it that wouldn't make it broken and brain dead with Goblin Giants P.E.K.K.A. for example, but I feel like the only viable option would be to increase its radius from 3 tiles to 3.5 tiles. Make it easier to use the spell offensive because you have a larger area, and it also makes it slightly easier to deal crown tower damage as well. So hopefully this buff would make Goblin Curse a little bit better without making it Brain Dead. Speaking of Brain Dead, we have the Rage. Its deploy time would be increased from 0.5 seconds to 0.8 seconds, making the spell less instantaneous, making it a little bit more different than the Zap, for example. Because the damage, it has a lot of value. The Rage, it is really good, so adding more unload time to all of that value will make the Rage just a little bit harder to get that value, hopefully making Rage a little bit less toxic. Next we have good old Log, and its projectile speed would be reduced by 10%, going from 200 to 180. This would make it essentially the same on defense, but using the Log offensively would now be a lot harder, hopefully making Log's versatility just a little bit weaker without really completely shutting down its efficiency. Next we would have the Barbarian Barrel, and the Barbarian deploy time would be increased from half a second to 0.8 seconds as well, making the difference between Log and the Barbarian Barrel even easier to see, because most of the characters that the Log one-shots and the Barbarian Barrel doesn't, the Barbarian can kill them off pretty quickly, and with this increased deploy time, it wouldn't do that as fast, hopefully making the difference between Log and Barbarian Barrel easier to notice. Next we'd have Snowball, and Snowball isn't just very good right now, so its ground tower damage would be increased from 30% to 35%, and the same thing would happen with the Evo Snowball, hopefully making the spell just a little bit stronger in general. Then we'd have Zap with the opposite change. Its ground tower damage would be reduced from 30% to 25%, and same would happen with the Evolution Zap. Now, I don't think that this would affect Zap too much, but I do think that the Evo Zap would be hurt quite a bit since it's, well, double the nerf essentially, hopefully making Zap's versatility, and especially the Evo Zap, a little bit weaker. And finally, we have the Mirror. Now, there isn't that much I could possibly do with just one change, so the only thing that came into my mind was the following. Mirror troops at their defeat, or a spell when it ends, would give its user back 1 elixir. So essentially, you do spend 1 elixir, but once that troop is gone, you would actually get the 1 elixir back. What would you do with this? I honestly have no idea, but the versatility is there and the potential is there. So you would always get that 1 extra elixir that you invested back, which by itself is already a huge buff, but I really don't think that these would necessarily break the Mirror. And there you have it, all spells in Clash Royale balanced with only one change. What are your thoughts on the balance changes? Write your opinion down in the comments down below, trust me, I will read them. And I'll see you all on the next video.